I also want to thank whatever body, governance-wise, made the decision to invite me to come here, whether that's a session or a council or whatever group it is. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here with you this morning. It also was a great privilege to have an opportunity so long before the experience to think about and pray about what I would say. Stephen gave me some context of some of the important decisions that lay before you as a congregation, that this is 160 years of history, but there's also this sense of what comes next, and asked me if I would give some consideration to that. Now, obviously, I don't know you as a congregation, and every church has its own unique personality and strengths, and so I don't pretend to know what that is. What I can say is that I have served a lot of different congregations over the years who have faced a similar challenge, and I will share with you some of the things that I feel have been beneficial to them as they've moved forward, and I hope and pray that it is helpful to you in the context of our lesson this morning. The first thing I want to talk about in connection with the Isaiah passage, which speaks about life as a blessing, and talks about the fact that God breathed into us the gift of life and into all creation the gift of His beauty. So I want to begin with what you might consider a little an off topic, but I'm going to bring us back to what I want to talk about this morning. But begin with this question. How many of you this morning have ever hired a landscaper to work on your property? Please raise your hand. Okay. Clearly you don't live in the suburbs. Okay. So, I have a friend who is in a congregation, was in a congregation in Toronto that I serve. He's now moved to another community. But he is a landscaper. He's from a Dutch family, meaning that for many generations his family have been involved in flowers and landscaping. And so he has this really in his blood. He has soil in his blood. And Mike's landscaping company is unique because unlike any other landscaper I've ever heard of, Mike's intent when you pick up the phone and call him is not that you interview him, but that he interviews you. And what Mike does when he engages you over the question of his possible landscaping work on your property is he wants to find out what your values are. He wants to know what you believe in and what matters to you. And then he wants to talk to you about what you hope to live out on your piece of land that you live on. Then he goes away and he investigates all of the indigenous plant life in the community, and putting together a plan based on your values and the indigenous plant life that exists in your community, he begins to plot a plan as to what your property will look like. Now you can imagine that this does not always go over with a potential customer, because the way we tend to think about landscapers is we've seen something on television or in some other neighborhood, or maybe when we were on vacation, and we like that Japanese maple, or we like that little gazebo, or we like something, and we say to the landscaper, make that happen. In Mike's case, he interviews you to find out your values, and then finds out what's already indigenous to your area, and brings it to life. Mike is a very deeply spiritual man, and he believes that creation brings out in us our spiritual lives. And one of the ways that he believes that happens is by understanding that creation is a blessing to us in and of itself, so that we don't need to transplant creation from other places, in other contexts, to make us feel whole. That God's creation is sufficient to live out our witness as God's people. when churches find themselves at a crossroads, it can become very tempting to want to be something that we've seen on television or in a magazine or at a friend's church and try to transplant that reality onto ourselves. And I've seen that happen. And most often it happens in evangelical churches. We go to a non-denominational evangelical church and we say to ourselves, their churches are full of people and it's shiny and new, and we're not so shiny and new. And so we want what they have. And we need a band, and we need to have seating that is comfortable, which is great, and we need to replicate what we've seen in our context and be that church that is bursting at the seams over there and be that people. So we got a book, right, where we go to a workshop and we come back and we have a plan to be just like that shiny church on the hill. But my experience is that that doesn't always work so well because the people who exist in our churches are not the same people who exist in those churches. And we end up feeling as though perhaps we're really failing because we can't quite get there. We're not that people, so we end up feeling less than. Then there are other people who say, instead of looking over there at that other church that's big and booming, we look in the past. And I saw some pictures on the screen of some of the Grace United Church in the old days. Now, I went to J. Wesley Smith Memorial Church in Halifax, which looks a lot like this church. Even with that false wall, right, that comes out. Anyway, an old Methodist church. And there are a lot of churches that, as they look forward, want to go backwards in terms of nostalgia, right? They want to build a church and be a church that's just like it was in the 50s when the place was full. So maybe the choir, all the women in the choir would wear those hats that they wore in the old choir. Remember those hats? Oh, yeah. Get some comments on that one. And then women in the church could wear gloves. My grandmother, we used to call her El Presidente. She was, you probably knew her. She was head of the UCW. She was head of the Temperance Society. Her name was Myrtle Pitcher, and she was the first female elder in our church, and my grandmother wore every Sunday a hat, long gloves to church. She never worn pants, or as women then called them, slacks. And Stephen would have to wear a black gown and stand before the pulpit. None of this moving around thing. He would have drums. I don't want to think about that. So anyway, all of that stuff, you would have to replicate. Do you know, I went to a church, and the last time I told a story in a church, I told the story I told the province where I was. And somebody in the church recognized the church, so I'm not going to tell you which province it was. or get it. That ain't gonna happen. So, the book of Isaiah, and this is 3rd Isaiah, talks about a people who are also at a crossroads. These are people who have come back from an exile, which, as usual, the Jewish people find themselves always being taken away, enslaved by some outside force. And now they've come back to their own land, and they've rebuilt the temple, and they're beginning to question what it's all about, because they're no longer in slavery. They've got the temple back. Everything has been replicated, but they can't go back because now they wonder what it's all about. Once you've gone through the trial of life, the naivete of your youth is no longer operable. You can't go back anymore. You now understand. I was listening to those verses that were being read just now. This notion that we'll live forever and that we'll never have, that, my friends, all of us who've had scares of cancer, have loved ones die too young, we all know that life is fragile and that there is tragedy and heartbreak and brokenness. And if you feel that if you pray the right way, none of that will happen, I feel like that's a good place to be, but it can't last for very long, because reality will bring us to another place. And yet, within the text of these words of hope and wonder, there is the possibility of how we live in the brokenness, which is the blessing of creation and the gift of life that God gives us. And it's in the now. It's in the understanding of who we are and the blessing that God has given you and me now. And so I want to end with this. I want you to think deeply and pray deeply about who you are and where you are now. Just like my friend Mike, the landscaper, who might interview you and ask you, Grace United Church, who you are. Right? I know all these churches in the 90s that went through, did you go through this mission statement thing? That's a big deal, right? That was big in the 90s. The only problem with mission statements is that they're so long they can fill up several pages in a bulletin. And in the end, if you throw the whole kitchen sink in, what's the difference between you as Grace United Church in Dartmouth and Grace United Church in Long Beach, Cape Breton, or whatever, right? I mean, the more specific you are, the more you have to leave out, but the more authentic the statement is. And a lot of churches have a really hard time being specific because we don't want to leave anything out. That's, for me as a minister, the most difficult part of the mission statement process is getting people to say, this is who we are and we're okay with it, versus throwing everything up on the page until now it's meaningless. So who are you? What are your values? What matters to you? What do you offer this community, downtown Dartmouth? What do you offer the people who live here? I've seen at least 3 churches that have really come to that kind of place, and they are not all things to all people, and they're comfortable living in the skin of their values and their blessing. The church I just left in Tantallon went through a process, and they came to this place where they believed that the notion of breaking bread together with the stranger was who they were. Because out in the suburbs, you constantly have to reinvent yourself for strangers, because people are there for 3 years in the military or the RCMP, and off they go. Or they've gone from Timberley to Tantallon to Kingswood. Because you gotta get there. You gotta get there. So prayers of the people. It's all done. There are only 15 of us. The songs are whatever Hugh Craven comes to his imagination. The reading is interesting. We once had a person stand up and read the Exodus 10 Commandments and tell us in detail whether he had done any of those things. Too much information. But it's totally authentic, and it's not for everybody. I had people come from hipsters from the Brunswick Street area come into church and say, "Oh, that's just too much." But if that kind of chaotic, life-giving, dynamic worship is you ought to be there, because there's no other church like Brunswick Street. And then there's, I met Alan from, had been at St. John's United Church. And a weekday evening, they have a service of Teze. Now,